proud son of Eastern Europe, a citizen of the world, and a much-loved man of God. The body of Pope John Paul II lies at rest this evening in the Vatican. 1 billion Catholics around the globe pray, reflect, and look ahead. A funeral is on the way, so is the naming of a successor. But that is later. Now is the time to mourn. And good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Paula Zahn in New York. With me from Vatican City, my colleagues Aaron Brown and Christian Amanpour. I'm curious if you see the same crowds that we saw a little bit earlier today at St. Peter's Square.
Well,
He would return to Poland 9 times. He visited Africa 10 times more often than any other continent. And his papal pilgrimages took him both near to devoutly Catholic Spain, to France, Portugal and Switzerland. And it took him far, to Asia and to South America, the continent with the greatest concentration of Catholics. He visited the US 7 times, his trips taking him from soup kitchens in Baltimore to a stadium in St. Louis, to New York's Central Park, where the faithful serenaded him with Silent Night. The pontiff also made history in the US by becoming the first pope to visit the White House. And during his papacy, the US and the Vatican re-established diplomatic relations for the first time in 115 years. He would make history elsewhere in the world too, as the first pope to visit communist Cuba in 1998, the first modern pope to set foot inside a synagogue in 1986, the first pope to set foot inside a mosque, and the first to establish diplomatic relations with both Israel and the PLO. His journeys took him nearly everywhere, brought him face to face with the famous and the rich, religious leaders and politicians. But you could see in his smile that what he loved most was meeting his faithful flock around the world, the same flock that now grieves the loss of its beloved shepherd.
And as we've been saying, the hundreds of thousands that have already been mourning here in Italy are going to hugely grow in the next few days. They're expecting millions of people to come, and it'll be a powerful sight to see indeed, Paula.
And the logistics that you all are talking about will be a nightmare with that much burden on the system. Christian, thank you so much. Leaders now from all over the globe have expressed their thoughts about Pope John Paul II. President Bush and the First Lady attended a mass for the Pope in Washington yesterday. The president paid tribute to the Pope's commitment to a culture of life, saying the world has lost a champion of human freedom. Israel's Prime Minister talked about the Pope's historic work toward a reconciliation between Christians and Jews, calling the Pope a man of peace and a friend of the Jewish people. Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, called the Pope a determined and deeply spiritual-minded person who worked to promote harmony and spiritual values. And earlier today, on our late edition, former First Lady Nancy Reagan shared some of her memories of Pope John Paul II. Mrs. Reagan noted the similarities of the Pope and her husband, the late President Reagan, while talking about the impact that both of them had on the world, particularly in the fall of communism.
He was very special. First of all, they were very much alike. I mean, these were two men who were former actors. They both loved the outdoors, sports, and very natural sports-minded and good at sports. And they shared the title of a great communicator, both of them. And they both had wonderful senses of humor. But also, when Ronnie was shot in '81, the Pope was shot in '81. And Ronnie died in June of this year. The Pope is dying this year. They were very, very much alike. They crossed paths a lot. What did you ask me? Wolf?
I was going to add, though, they, as you point out, they had these assassination attempts, 6 weeks apart back in 1981. That must have when they met in subsequent years, forged a unique bond between these two leaders.
That plus the kind of men they were, and their desire to do something about communism. All of that.
Well, they both played pivotal roles in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. When you were there, did they talk about that in your presence? Do you remember meetings where you heard both of these leaders speaking about the ill effects of communism?
No, I didn't hear it. I know they talked about it, obviously, and maybe that one picture that I don't know whether you're showing it or not, but I have a picture of the two of them in the library here. They're both sitting down. The Pope is sitting with his head bent, listening, and Ronnie is halfway out of his chair and talking to the Pope, and his hand is out and his finger is out. Obviously, he's telling him something. And you wonder, what in the world is Ronnie saying? And the Pope is listening very carefully to it. It's a wonderful picture.
Nancy Reagan in a heartfelt conversation, a rare public conversation with Wolf Blitzer, pointing out what she sees as some strong similarities between her husband's legacy and circumstances of history that he was exposed to and the Pope. The cardinals of the Catholic Church have been electing popes the same way for hundreds of years now. What was the Pope like before he attained the highest office in the Catholic Church? I'll be talking with a Monsignor who had a personal relationship with the late Pontiff. That interview is straight ahead. But something will be different this time around. We'll tell you how the conclave is changing a little bit later on in this hour. And coming up next...
How would you like to take
Sta
By the time he became pontiff, the Pope had mastered 8
i confini
languages.
degli stati?
Ordinary people from all walks of life are bearing witness to their affection for Pope John Paul II. And in Vatican City and all over the world, untold millions are mourning a pope who was deeply committed to the Church's missionary spirit. Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete had a personal relationship with this pope going way back to 1976 before he ever assumed the papacy. Monsignor, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
You had one last conversation with the Pope.
Yes.
What was it about?
It was about what I'm doing right now.
And that is?
I had already been approached by CNN to whether I would do this when he died. We've been expecting his death for so long. But I went to see him and I felt I should say something about it. I kind of felt guilty that I had said yes, even signed a contract. So I said, Holy Father, I have something to tell you. I fear I have signed a contract to go on CNN and say nice things about you after you're dead. And he just looked at me with a very wicked type look and he said, I am puzzled. How do they know that I am dying before you? And I said, well, do you know something I don't know? He said, no. I said, well, let's make this agreement, Holy Father. If I die first, you will go to CNN and say nice things about me. Well, he died first, so I am here saying nice things about him.
So he could have a sense of humor when you had to confront the
something
one of the most serious
yes.
things in life. Your friendship, as we said, stretches back more than 40 years. You knew him long before the rest of the world even know who he was.
Yes,
and you believe that his love of poetry and his love of language and his passion for acting is what helped inform him.
I believe he cannot be understood except through that lens. I'm sorry, but every time more I think about it, the more I see the coverage these days, the more I am convinced that this is the key to understanding this man.
How so?
because it's what unifies it all together. Otherwise, we see the endless discussion about how the Pope is so liberal in some issues, so conservative in others. He attracts great numbers of youth who don't agree with his teaching or don't follow him. He visits right-wing dictators and then left-wing. A week later, he's offending the people he has made happy the week before. And you want to know, like, is there a unifying point, or really, this guy just has no unifying point? Is this all show? Is this all diplomacy, practical diplomacy? No, I believe there is a unifying point, and that is his profound experience of humanity. First question he ever asked me is, what language do you think best communicates what a human being is all about?
And what was your answer?
Well, I was confused, and happily I didn't say anything. He said, well, try scientific language, technical language, he said. I used to be a scientist.
Right, and he was very
and he said,
curious about that.
Well, yes, and happy we discussed that first. But then he said, the problem is that today we are beginning to express our humanity in technical and scientific terms, and that is not enough. I said, well, then what is the language? And he said, the language of poetry, of symbol, of myth, accompanied by action, by gestures, physical gestures. He said, the physical is absolutely necessary. We are not about an intellectual discourse. To look at someone and smile and say thank you is the most powerful way. He says it's the language of theater. He said, so that's why I've devoted my life to study and writing theater and about theater.
And you made the same point that you've just made in a column that you wrote in the Daily News today that I wanted to share with our audience now, where you talked about these seeming contradictions in him, and you said people see in him a contradiction. He was so liberal in some issues, especially in the areas of social justice and peace, and so conservative in others, mostly having to do with sex. He understood the contradiction. He saw it as a contradiction in us. The problem is dualism. It's precisely the separation between our gestures and the truth of our humanity. That you see at its very essence is the core of who this man was.
I would say that his greatest proposal, he may be totally wrong, his proposal, what he tries to get ahead, as you see in his last book, is that intellectualism is the problem. We need the physical to back the word.
Well, your affection for this great man certainly shines through tonight.
Well, never changed my life. Thank you so much.
For spending time with us this evening. The Pope is credited with helping to end the Cold War, of course, but it wasn't just politics he was interested in changing.
It introduced AIDS to the world, I think, in a way that they hadn't been willing to see it before.
And how the Pope's embrace of one special little boy helped the world see the human side of AIDS in the early years of the epidemic.
CNN Tonight. Pope John Paul II, the man, his faith, and legacy. Paul Azan hosts People in the News, CNN Tonight, 7 Eastern.
Pope would do, and in the course of that, he came upon a young boy, a 13-year-old boy, as I recall, named Brendan O'Rourke, and young Brendan was an AIDS patient, and the Pope embraced him, touched him, and you have to put yourself back to some degree to that time and what we thought about AIDS and how fearful everyone was of AIDS, and the Pope's embrace sent messages to the world. It also touched this young boy, and we talked today with his mother about her remembrances of the import of that moment.
I'm Elaine O'Rourke, and my son Brendan had been diagnosed with AIDS when he was 4 years old. We were desperate for a cure for Brendan, but we were not seeing this as a way to have Brendan cured. We were just seeing this as a way to bring comfort and blessing to him and our family. We were sitting right about here when the Pope came in, and we were surrounded by, all sorts of faithful. And as he made his way up, we were very excited, and then he paused here, stopped, and that's when the whole embrace happened. And Brendan reached out, and the Pope embraced him. And everybody around us was clapping, and I see a lot of people had tears in their eyes, and it was beautiful and quite memorable. It just seemed so natural. And the grabbing of the Pope's ear, that was just something Brendan did when anybody was hugging him or holding him. A good cold ear is just something that Brendan liked to grab onto.
God loves you. God loves you all. He loves those of you who are sick, those who are suffering from AIDS.
It introduced AIDS to the world, I think, in a way that they hadn't been willing to see it before. It was seen as a disease that only certain people were getting, and instead of just a disease that people were getting. And this broke down barriers, I believe, put a human face on the tragedy.
We can talk, and over the course of the week, I'm sure we will talk about the controversies surrounding the Pope and AIDS and all of that. It seems appropriate, however, to remember that in that moment, he said to not just this little child, but to the entire world, we will not shun you. We are not afraid of you. And that's, that too is a mark of humanity and greatness.
And I think also one of those real marks of this Pope, who really in many ways did embody contradictions. He did go and embrace that little boy, and as the mother said, put a human face on this. But there are so many AIDS patients who regret the fact that so many people have died because of his strict sanction against using condoms to stop the spread of AIDS. But as Aaron says, that is for perhaps future days. Now we're talking about his travels, and actually that moment in San Francisco was one that our guest, actually our CNN Papal Affairs analyst, Delia Gallagher, remembers, because you were there. You were on the street waving to him, she said.
I was, yeah, 1987. And little did I realize then that I would be traveling with him on his papal plane some 10 years later.
And you've experienced both personally from, I suppose, being a young girl when you waved at him there, but then professionally, following this, the most traveled Pope in the world.
Yeah.
What did those travels mean beyond just getting on a plane?
Well, one of the things that struck me about traveling with the Pope was just how simple his entourage was. You know, the plane was a regular Alitalia plane. His seat was a regular business class size seat. There was no real fanfare about traveling with the Pope until you hit the ground. You know, behind the scenes, it was all very normal.
You know, I had one occasion to travel with him when we went to Sarajevo, and the reason I bring it up is because I want to know, when you were on board with him, did he used to talk to the press? Because by then it was sort of 97, he was already a little infirm, and he did come to the curtains and sort of looked and waved and said hello, but there was no personal interaction.
I'll tell you what happened. He didn't come back anymore at that stage. He stayed up in his seat, and so for the new journalists who if it was their first trip, I remember that my colleagues sort of passed a note up through we sit in the back and the cardinals sit in the middle and the Pope and his secretary sit in the front. They passed a note up through the cardinals to ask if I could be allowed to go up and meet the Pope. So I went up to the Pope instead of the Pope coming back to me, which obviously was a wonderful experience.
Well, what did you say to him? What did he say to you?
Well, he did say a few things, but if you don't mind, I won't go into them. They're very dear to me, obviously, and so.
So this wasn't professional. This was just you personally approaching him.
Oh yes, I didn't take the opportunity to interview him. I felt, you know, it was a trip to Poland, and it was just so moving for him, and I didn't bother him with
the fact that he did travel so much was as much to bring the ministry of Catholicism and Christianity to the rest of the world. What do you think he got out of those incredible trips?
Well, it's been said before, and I've seen it, and you probably have too. When he gets in front of a crowd, he was entirely rejuvenated. Sometimes when we were with him on the plane or behind the scenes, you would see that he was very tired and not looking so good, and we would be worried that he wouldn't be able to make it. Those trips are very demanding. I mean, people don't realize the schedule that he kept up on those trips. And then he would get out on the stage, and he was just a new person.
There was a controversial moment, I don't know whether you were on that trip, but the trip to India, when he seemed to appeal for sort of mass conversion of then, you know, Hindus in India to Christianity, and people were quite sort of offended at that moment. Did you ever notice times when there perhaps was a little friction with his evangelism?
Well, I didn't, because I came in at the end of the pontificate, and I think by then he had just achieved such a huge popularity. But on the other hand, the Pope never drew back from his convictions. I mean, he didn't go just to be the superstar. He did go to give his message. That was his purpose, to evangelize. And so whether that message was accepted by other people or not, he still felt it important to give it. But as Aaron mentioned earlier, he nonetheless embraced everybody, whether you agreed with his message or not.
Delia Gallagher, thanks very much. And we'll be talking a lot more about his missions, his message, about how he reached out and embraced. And just when we talk about embracing, every time I see St. Peter's Square and I see those incredible Bernini colonnades, recalling the words the Pope used about those and to describe them, it is about embracing. And that is what's going to happen when these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people come here to try to get close to when the funeral occurs. And they will be embraced by those semicircular colonnades that have stood the time of history and are here throughout the ages for the faithful. Paula?
Thank you both, Christiana and Delia. And of course, we all, I guess, need to focus on succession at some point and choosing the next leader of the Catholic Church. It is a process steeped in tradition, but something will be very different this time around. We will give you an inside look at a Cardinals conclave, plus the inner workings of the day-to-day tasks at the Vatican. We're going to show you rarely seen rooms and activities in the world's smallest state.
Almost 1 o'clock in the morning here in Krakow, and I can tell you that people are still coming in, laying candles. Indeed, the palace grounds are awash in candles and flowers. Tribute to the man Poles know as Jan Paweł II. Of course, to many Poles, he is and has been their king in exile because he lived in Rome. He's the man who restored dignity to this country after it was humiliated. One Polish friend said to me today that this was a man, John Paul II, was the man who ended Poland's inferiority complex. So indeed, across Poland in Warsaw, there was a mass late this afternoon. 100 to 150,000 Polish Catholics came out. Here in Krakow and all across this country in small churches and in larger areas there have been vigils. The reason John Paul II was so important to Poles, of course, is that he restored to them their country. Remember, Poles were humiliated for 50 years by the Soviets at the end of the Second World War. Before that, they were almost obliterated by the Nazis, and throughout their tragic history, especially in the 19th century, Poles were partitioned by the Prussians, by the Russians, and also by the Austrians. So when John Paul II came along and helped throw off the yoke of communism, he established for himself a love among his own people, which is ineradicable. Paula?
Well, it's a powerful reminder of how his mindset was fostered from a very early age. Walt Rogers, thanks so much. When we come back, we are going to give you a rare...
Look at this signature. It's Galileo, the Galileo. Here's a handwritten letter from Michelangelo. But never mind the history, the art, and the architecture, there's also diplomacy. Nearly 200 nations maintain diplomatic relations with the Vatican, with all the diplomatic formalities that entails. Everywhere you see the colorful presence of the Swiss Guard. Each member is really Swiss. They all have to be Catholic, and they aren't just for show.
But they're actually a very well-trained security force, some of whom operate in plain clothes, just like our Secret Service.
The Vatican's work does not stop with the passing of the Pope. It will all be here tomorrow and in the next few weeks, ready for when the next Pope is elected and takes this walk.
One individual has just been elected, and he has to stand up and walk across the Sistine Chapel. And he's heading towards a door that's in the wall where Michelangelo's Last Judgment is. And he's heading for that door. There's a room on the other side called the Room of Tears. And as we were filming this, it occurred to me what kind of awesome burden was descending on this guy's shoulders as he made this walk out of his peer group, out of the men who had elected him, because he was no longer a peer. He was now going to be their leader, and not just their leader, but the leader of 1 billion people spiritually. And to imagine what kind of burden that was just overwhelming. No wonder they call it the Room of Tears.
It's all waiting for the next chapter in the still unfinished work of what the Church calls salvation history.
And indeed, the next chapter will be when the conclave gathers inside that Sistine Chapel to elect a new pope. And this National Geographic special will be showed at 10 p.m. Aaron, it is incredible when you think about that Vatican, the Sistine Chapel. I always think about Michelangelo lying on his back for months and years to paint that ceiling and to paint the Last Judgment. It is magnificent.
I just thought today how blessed, how fortunate I feel to be in this city and overlooking that place at this time, talking about this moment. It's something. Paula?
And we have a lot more coverage ahead for those of you who will be staying with us tonight. Christiane, Aaron, thanks so much. Stay with us until midnight. Larry King Live will be up at 9 and live coverage from 10 to 12. Good night.
End of the month. The commitment.
I am Jesus Christ. In this generation, all the world will be destroyed.
It took the Pope months to recover. Aja came to trial and said he was hired by Bulgarian secret agents. It was a conspiracy the prosecutor could never prove. And later, the Pope went to Aja's jail cell to forgive the man who tried to kill him. What we said to each other is a secret between him and me, the Pope told reporters. I spoke to him as I would speak to a brother whom I've forgiven and who enjoys my confidence. Confidential dialogue between individuals and between countries was a mainstay of John Paul II's papacy. Under the Pope's leadership, the Vatican quietly mediated Lithuania's breakaway from the Soviet Union.
When Argentina and Chile were at each other's throats and almost going to war, he stepped in and mediated that crisis because he was seen as someone that was respected by both sides.
He mediated a civil war in Mozambique and ended the United States invasion of Panama by convincing Manuel Noriega to give himself up.
Whenever he could do that, he offered his services and tried to help bring people together to avoid war.
Ahead on People in the News, the peace-loving Pope demonstrates his less diplomatic side.
John Paul II became very hard in his face, very tough, raised his index and say, you must get in order with the church, you must get in order with the church.
That aim at ending the arms race.
But he believes strongly in preaching moral justice to the point that Vatican observers argue he changed the fundamentals of the papacy.
His engagement as pontiff was not only to spread out the gospel, to spread out the faith, but also to transform the Roman papacy into the spokesman of human rights.
Social organization exists only for the service of man and for the protection of his dignity, and that it cannot claim to serve the common good when human rights are not safeguarded.
He's also been an extraordinary prophet and spokesperson for the third world, you know, speaking out in favor of forgiving third world debt, pointing out the downside of the globalization of the economy, the impact that has on people's lives.
The Pope, as he traveled the Catholic world through the 1980s, put the church squarely on the side of the downtrodden and underprivileged. But apparently, because of his lifelong struggle against communism, he could never accept what some of his priests and bishops called liberation theology. It, too, championed the cause of the downtrodden against right-wing dictatorships in Latin America. He disciplined the left-leaning churchmen who supported it.
They were using, in some ways, the conceptual language of Marxism, the idea of class struggle. And of course, the Pope, coming out of the experience of communist oppression in Poland, I think was scandalized by that idea.
Though only a few city blocks in area, Vatican City is a sovereign country with vast diplomatic influence. John Paul II, as head of state and spiritual leader to 1/6 of the world's population, was an immense political force on the world stage, but not an easy force to understand.
On so many political, economic, justice issues, the Pope is way to the left of liberal Democrats in this country. On the other hand, he's against abortion. He's very strict in his views on sexual morality. Suddenly, he becomes branded a conservative.
To the extent that he keeps reminding people about social justice, that seems to be a very progressive aspect of his papacy. But to the extent that he fails to apply those canons of justice to the internal matters that affect all Catholics within his own church, then he appears to be more reactionary than progressive.
The most consistent tenet of John Paul's reign was a demand for discipline. While he initiated numerous consultative bishops' conferences called synods, some of those who attended said dissent was not an option. He did not want his churchmen to confuse believers with different versions of the faith.
Polarization and destructive criticism have no place among those who are of the household of faith.
When he came to power, when he was elected, he realized that one thing that he had to do was to restore clarity to Catholic teaching. And he says, okay, maybe they won't obey, maybe they don't accept, but at least they'll know what the church stands for.
Down on the front lines, the Pope's priestly foot soldiers reported that his fixed teachings on issues such as sexuality, divorce, abortion, and the role of women were driving Catholics from the church.
The Pope's conservatism on issues such as artificial contraception or abortion comes, I think, from his view of women. I think the Pope grew up with that. It's reinforced in Poland by a fierce devotion to the Virgin Mary as the patroness of Poland.
Others defend the Pope's purist interpretations and his opposition to the ordination of women priests.
Catholics believe what the priest is doing is, in a sense, representing the sacrifice of Christ. He's standing in the person of Christ. He represents Christ in a way. And it makes sense then that someone who is representing Christ would be male, as Christ was.
Shame! 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 Shame!
The Pope also stood firm in his opposition to abortion.
The Pope wrote a very famous apostolic letter in 1988. If the choice is, well, you're involuntarily pregnant, well, then you should, as Mary accepted her role as the Mother of God, you should accept your role.
Not only did the Pope not budge on his beliefs, he also used the Vatican's diplomatic resources to press his ideas outside the church.
The Vatican delegation to the UN Conference on Population in Cairo in 1994 was fiercely fighting delegations from Western European countries that were trying to make sure that the European Union did permit legalized abortion and the like. And even in 1995 at the Beijing Conference on the Status of Women, again, the big UN conference, the Vatican was there doing its best to influence these ideas.
With the Vatican's observer status in the UN and close relations with governments around the world, John Paul II never shied away from asserting his morality.
These are moral issues. These are the kinds of things that the church should speak out on.
Ahead on People in the News, the Pope takes on a glaring sex scandal that shook the church and stunned Vatican insiders.
They were taken aback and really shocked by this and didn't have a clue as to how to respond.
Then came a book deal, John Paul's answers to 20 questions about life and his philosophy, which were published in the same year as the CD. Crossing the Threshold of Hope became an international bestseller, allowing the Pope's views to reach an audience wider still. He also instituted World Youth Days, which became a revered tradition around the world. To the astonishment of those around him, young people by the millions flocked to see him, even when the generation gap grew as the Pope's age and infirmity took their toll.
With the end of the left of communism, he was left as one of the voices in the world that was speaking out against everyone who runs things, strangely enough. And so in the year 2000, 2 million young people came to Rome, and they said, John Paul II, we love you.
John Paul II, he loves you.
Strange. Who would think that a pope, an old man who tells people not to do things, would be loved by young people?
The Pope succeeds in fascinating these people who, at least for some days or for some hours during a Mass, feel they can live and they can engage for a better world.
As Pope John Paul II labored to make a better world, there were predictions he would not reach his most cherished goal, taking the Church into the third millennium. When the Jubilee year began to mark the 2000th anniversary of Christ's birth, the Pope was leading the celebrations. During that year, he accomplished 2 further goals. The first was a Day of Atonement.
Chiediamo perdono per le divisioni.
Let us ask for forgiveness for the divisions that have come between Christians, for the use of violence that some of them have resorted to in serving truth, and for the attitudes of mistrust and hostility adopted sometimes towards followers and believers of other religions.
He felt it was important to acknowledge our sins against our Jewish brothers and sisters, to acknowledge our sins in the Crusades against the Muslims.
His second goal during the Jubilee year, a rigorous and politically challenging trip through the Holy Land. There will be no more enduring image of his papacy than his trembling hand placing a note in Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, asking the Jewish people to forgive the Church for its mistreatment of them over the centuries.
He has made Catholic-Jewish relations a main part of Catholic teaching. The other lasting achievement is that this Pope has said again and again and again that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews and Judaism, is a sin against God. That's very, very important.
But the Pope's efforts in the later years of his papacy to reach out to Judaism and other religions met with only mixed success.
Well, I think one of the biggest disappointments of the Pope in his papacy has been his failure to really reestablish good relations with the Orthodox.
Orthodox churches were especially suspicious of the Pope's motives. His greatest goal, to bridge Christianity's great schism, the 1,000-year-old split between the Church of Rome and the Eastern churches, proved elusive. The more he reached out, it seemed the more they backed away.
Theologically, the Orthodox and the Catholics are very, very close together. There are disagreements on the role of the papacy, and the Pope wanted to be able to talk to them about this.
The Pope's tenure was marked by grand lessons and subtle defeats. While he persevered with his ecumenical efforts, problems were brewing inside his church. Coming up on People in the News, John Paul II fights to preserve faith in a Catholic church shaken by scandal.
In our fast-paced world, it's important to take a moment to relax. Immerse yourself in one of the world's most inspiring musical experiences. Introducing the most relaxing classical album.
Begin 15 to 20 days after the Pope dies.
For many, the Vatican is a museum, but during this time, during this interregnum period, it is a living, breathing place. The cardinals from all around the world are coming here to Vatican City, where just a few hundred feet from here in the Sistine Chapel, they will meet behind closed doors. The doors will be locked, sealed with wax on either side, and inside, under Michelangelo's masterpiece, they will decide who is the next Pope.
But first, the Sistine Chapel will be swept for bugs, recording devices, and any other means of electronic surveillance, all in an effort to keep the proceedings completely secret. The foundation for today's conclave traditions date all the way back to 1274, after the Church went without a pope for nearly 3 years. When Pope Gregory X was finally chosen, he decreed that in future elections, cardinals would be locked in the chapel until a new pope was named. But this year, thanks to changes made by Pope John Paul II, the cardinals will be able to retire each night in comfort, That's because for the first time in history, they'll be permitted to leave the chapel so they can sleep in a nearby dormitory known as Casa Santa Marta, which will also be swept for bugs. During the daytime, the cardinals will vote twice in the morning and twice in the afternoon, handwriting their choice for pope on ballots inscribed with the words, "Eligo in summum pontificem," I elect as supreme pontiff. Between the votes, there'll be discussions, genteel politicking.
I can't do nuances in Italian, and sometimes nuances are the most important things in situations like this. So I would hope that I could speak English or Spanish. I can do nuances in Spanish, but we'll see.
If no candidate receives 2/3 of the vote, the ballots and tally sheets will be burned in a little stove just off the Sistine Chapel, sending black smoke up a 60-foot pipe. A plume of black smoke means we are still without a pope. But when a candidate does receive 2/3 of the vote, chemicals will be added to the burning ballots to make the smoke appear white and signal that a new pontiff has been chosen. The new pope will be asked if he accepts his appointment and led into a small room just off the Sistine Chapel called the Chapel of Tears to reflect the heavy burden the pope will carry. Inside, he'll find papal robes in small, medium, and large. Once dressed, the new pope will greet the cardinals and walk toward this balcony facing St. Peter's Square. Leading him will be the cardinal deacon, whose job it is to announce to the anxious crowd, "Habemus Papam," we have a pope. Then the new pontiff will greet the faithful and give his first blessing to the city of Rome and the rest of the world. Of course, the question is who will be that next pope. It is an election, of course, though it is steeped in tradition and spirituality and religious devotion. It is an election, and matters of age play a part, country of origin, and belief systems. We're going to look right after this break at all of those aspects, how they play a role in the election of the new pope, and who some of the front runners are or believed to be are, and the possibility of a dark horse, someone at this point who is not considered a front runner may just be elected. We'll see how that may affect the world's 1 billion Catholics. We'll be right back.
He was human. He really showed people that he loved them, and he loved everyone, and he didn't matter who you were, and that was important. And he recognized the value of all people.
CNN Tonight, as millions mourn Pope John Paul II, Vatican experts on his legacy and who could follow him. Larry King Live, CNN Tonight, 9 Eastern.
You know what we should do with that money we won? I've always dreamed that we could take the most romantic vacation ever. Paris, Rome, Venice. To share all that with the man I love would mean everything to me.
I'll get that.
Play the Connecticut Lottery's Mega Money Scratch Game with a top prize of $20,000 that you can spend any way you want.
You gotta take this back. What? Oh! Hey!
I am Daniela Maldonado, and I'm from Manalapan, New Jersey. Optimum Online, we started using...
Shall build my church. Outside is St. Peter's Square, the magnificent open area now packed with mourners. But there is much more to see. Along the deeply shaded walkways and bright sunny courtyards are the buildings and palaces where the rest of the Catholic Church's daily work is conducted. There's art restoration, preserving a collection of paintings, sculpture, and tapestries from the best artists the world has known.
They have a tapestry laboratory there where they maintain these amazing, huge, like 20 by 30-foot tapestries, which were done by Raffaello, the famous Renaissance artist. And these nuns spend their entire lives restoring the silk and wool and cotton thread. I mean, it's a vocation. It's like a form of prayer.
They don't just work on preserving art here. Over at the Vatican Library, they preserve history as well. Here's Henry VIII's petition for divorce. The dangling red seals are from bishops who took his side. The Pope said no, history changed. Look at this signature. It's Galileo, the Galileo. Here's a handwritten letter from Michelangelo. But never mind the history, the art, and the architecture, there's also diplomacy. Nearly 200 nations maintain diplomatic relations with the Vatican, with all the diplomatic formalities that entails. Everywhere you see the colorful presence of the Swiss Guard.
Each member is really Swiss. They all have to be Catholic, and they aren't just for show.
But they're actually a very well-trained security force, some of whom operate in plain clothes, just like our Secret Service.
The Vatican's work does not stop with the passing of the Pope. It will all be here tomorrow and in the next few weeks, ready for when the next Pope is elected and takes this walk.
One individual has just been elected, and he has to stand up and walk across the Sistine Chapel. And he's heading towards a door that's in the wall where Michelangelo's Last Judgment is. And he's heading for that door. There's a room on the other side called the Room of Tears. And as we were filming this, it occurred to me what kind of awesome burden was descending on this guy's shoulders as he made this walk out of his peer group, out of the men who had elected him, because he was no longer a peer. He was now going to be their leader, and not just their leader, but the leader of 1 billion people spiritually. And to imagine what kind of burden that was just overwhelming. No wonder they call it the Room of Tears.
It's all waiting for the next chapter in the still unfinished work of what the Church calls salvation history. Well, Pope John Paul II, of course, didn't stay cloistered behind the closed doors of the Vatican. He ventured out more than any other pope in history, traveling far and wide to places big and small, meeting more people perhaps than any other single person on this planet in human history. So many people felt a personal connection to the pontiff. Personal stories we have heard all day long about this pope changing people's lives. In a moment, we're going to tell you one man's story, a story he calls a miracle, how one performance for the pope changed this man's life forever.
Viene cantato il Salmo 22.
Psalm 22 is what is being sung. The good shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. Psalm 22 or Psalm 23 in some other texts, according to the version.
This is the procession which has now begun. You have been hearing some of the members of Vatican TV describing. Let us tell you now what you're going to be seeing over the next several minutes. This is the beginning of the procession of the Pope's body. It's being taken from that Sala Clementina, which is the place right there in the Apostolic Palace. This is the place where the Pope has lived for oh so many years. Now it's going to be taken out the doors and through St. Peter's Square, eventually ending up in St. Peter's Basilica. The reason they're taking it there is so that other members of the public, all the thousands of people who will be coming from throughout the world, can give one final goodbye, one final viewing of Pope John Paul II. We will let you share this moment with us.
et misericordia subsequentur me, omnibus diebus vitae me.
We're going to continue to keep these amazing pictures up as the procession takes place, moving the Pope's body through St. Peter's Square. It's about to go into the outdoors among the thousands of faithful that have gathered to pay their respects. Among those people are Bill Hemmer is there. Bill, earlier, as I understand it, you had a chance actually to go into the room. You were invited, one of the select few, to have a viewing with the Pope before the body was moved.
In the Apostolic Palace, you're exactly right, in the Hall of Clementine, as they refer to it in English here, Darren. I'm able to see what you're seeing at home based on the giant video monitors that are set up here in St. Peter's Square. And this is an absolutely extraordinary sight. The bells are tolling around the Vatican. Giant speakers have been set up to pump in the music that you now hear at home. And when they lifted the Pope's body inside that hall, that begins what will be a very long procession through the palace, which is a huge building in its own right. Somewhat of a maze just to figure out how to work your way around there. When we were there earlier today, we had an extraordinary opportunity to pay our final respects to Pope John Paul II. You're not allowed to spend much time there, a little less than a minute, but enough time to be able to take in the moment and the gravity of this time for the Catholic Church. He had a rosary in his hand. The crimson vestments that you have seen adorn both sides of his body. His red shoes can be seen as well, and a bishop's mitre hat tops his head. There was a candle burning to the right, and there was a large crucifix set off to the left-hand side. And inside this room that earlier we compared to the size of a basketball court are the most beautiful frescoes you will ever see in your life, on the ceilings and on the walls and the marble floors as well. And there was such a display of respect and dignity on behalf of everyone who had the opportunity to be in there. And you can see so many people crying, literally in tears, as they left that hall. What you're seeing here now, Darren, in a second here, I'm going to use these binoculars just because the screen's a little far away from me. But as they exit the palace, which is just off to the right here, across St. Peter's Square, they'll come down another set of steps. And there are a series of courtyards inside that palace as well. Then eventually we'll see the Pope's body return to this square where he has found essentially his home for the past 26 years. And as they continue, let's listen again.
Esulterando nel Signore I corpi umiliati nella morte.
cenim veritatem in corde dilexisti, et in occulto sapientiam manifestasti mihi. Exultabum Domino, ossa asperges mei sopo et munda, lavabis me et superniveam de albavo. Exultabum Domino, ossa facies gaudium et laetitia, et exultabum tossaque contrivisti. Exultabum Domino, ossa faciem tuam a peccatis meis, et omnes iniquitates meas dele. Exultabum Domino, ossa spiritum firmum innova in visceribus meis. Exultabum Domino, ossa humilia. Ne proicias mea faciem.
Italian families, many of whom have been connected to the papacy in some way for centuries, who are selected to assist the Pope in various ceremonial functions. So, for example, when there are private audiences inside this building, the Apostolic Palace, they will assist with making sure people are seated, making sure that when people come up to meet the Pope, they're introduced properly and so forth. They also greet visiting dignitaries on behalf of the Pope. So, for example, on the 3 occasions when President George Bush came to meet Pope John Paul II, it was the papal gentleman who he would first be greeted by, then the Pope's public secretary, Archbishop James Harvey, and finally, of course, the Holy Father himself. And so these are the men who, every time the Pope had an event in the Apostolic Palace, were by his side, taking care of his needs. And here on John Paul's farewell to the Apostolic Palace, his final event, so to speak, in this building that was the very heart of his pontificate, they are once again at his side, making sure that he has what he needs.
The enormity of the event, as you're saying, his final journey. Let's listen and watch.
Sancti Petre et Paule, Sancte Andrea, Sancti Ioannes et Jacobe, Sancte Thomas, Sancti Philippe et Jacobe, Sancte Bartolome, Sancte Matteo, Sancti Simon et benedicta Dei, ora de proeo, Sancte Matia, ora proeo, Sancte Luca, ora proeo, Sancte Marcet, ora proeo, Sancte Barnaba, ora proeo, Sancta Maria Magdalena, ora proeo.
La piazza è gremita,
is full of people right from the central avenue in Via della Conciliazione.
della campana.
We can hear the chant, we can hear the song of prayer together with the bell toll.
Sancte Corneli, Sancte Existe, Sancte Ioannes, Sancte Martine, Sancte Damase, Sancte Leo Magne,
Ed ecco che ora
And here
la
now
salma varca
the body of the
il
pontiff
portone di bronzo
is
e possiamo dire è sulla piazza.
going through the bronze door and then onto the square.
Sancte Pie, omnes sancti pontifices Romani, Sancte Stefane, Sancti protomartires Romani, Sancte Ignati Antiochene, Sancte Policarpe, Sancte Hippolyte, Sancti Justine et Apolloni, Sancte Laurenti, Sancte Tarsici, Sancte Cipriane, Sancte Sebastiane, Sancte Bonifati, Sancte Stanislae, Sancte Toma, Sancte Ioannes et Toma, Sancte Paule, Sancte Ioannes et Isaac, Sancte Petre, Sancte Carole, Sancte Perpetua et Felicitas, Sancta Agnes, Sancta Cecilia, Sancta Eugenia, Santa Maria, ora pro eum. Omnes sancti martires, ora pro eum. Sancte Ambrosi, ora pro eum. Sancte Hieronime, ora pro eum. Sancte Augustine, ora pro eum. Sancte Athanasi, ora pro eum. Sancti Basili et Gregori Naziancene, ora pro eum. Sancte Ioannes Chrysostome, ora pro eum. Sancte Martine, ora pro eum. Sancte Patrici, ora pro eum. Sancti Cyrille et Methodi, ora pro eum. Sancte Carole, ora pro eum. Sancte Francisce, ora pro eum. Sancte Antoni, ora pro eum. Sancti Benedicte et Bernarde, ora pro eum. Sancti Francisce et Dominice, ora pro eum. Sancte Thomas, ora pro eum. Sancte Ignati, ora pro eum. Sancte Francisce, ora pro eum. Sancte Vincenti, ora pro eum. Sancte Ioannes Maria, ora pro eum. Sancte Filippe, ora pro eum. Sancte Gaspar, ora pro eum. Sancte Vincenti, ora pro eum. Sancte Ioannes, ora pro eum. Sancta Sabina, ora pro eum. Sancta Marcella, ora pro eum. Sancta Paola, ora pro eum. Sancta Francisca, ora pro eum.
La salma in questo
The body of the pontiff was turned round towards the square so that the faithful could see him in the square and in Via della Conciliazione, almost as if he is speaking. Although dead, he still speaks. So let us listen to his message.
Ed ora, and
now,
le spoglie mortali di Giovanni Paolo II varcano la soglia della Basilica,
go through the door and enters the basilica, where he will remain until the funeral on Friday, to then, after the Requiem Mass, to be taken to the place of burial.
La Basilica
The
di San Pietro accoglie,
of St. Peter's welcomes
inondata di
the
luce,
Pope,
il suo pastore.
and there is light to welcome the shepherd.
Christe, Fili Dei vivi, qui nunc mundum venisti, qui in cruce pependisti,
abbi pietà di lui, è la risposta, miserere ei.
qui in sepulcro iacuisti, qui a mortuis resurrexisti.
Tu che sei venuto in questo mondo, tu che fosti appeso alla croce, tu che per noi ti consegnasti alla morte, tu che giacesti nel sepolcro, tu che sei risorto dai morti, tu che sei asceso al cielo, tu che hai mandato il tuo Santo Spirito.
And so the procession of the body of Pope John Paul II, it continues. We've watched as it's made its way, and the procession has made its way through St. Peter's Square and now into St. Peter's Basilica. To understand more of what we're seeing, also of what we're hearing, let's bring back our Vatican analyst, John Allen. John.
Well, what we have just seen, of course, is the body of John Paul II being brought into St. Peter's Basilica. I'm sure you saw that moment where before they actually crossed the threshold and entered the Basilica, the body was turned around so the Pope once more could face the people, the crowd, gathered in St. Peter's Square and all the way down the Via della Conciliazione. That's the broad street leading up to the Basilica here in Rome. The Vatican estimates that over the course of John Paul's pontificate, some 15 million people gathered in that square or in the audience hall to take part in audiences, the regular Wednesday audiences given by John Paul II. And this was one last opportunity for this public that turned out in so regularly in such large numbers to hear the Pope, to see him and to say goodbye. And now they are processing down the central nave.
Make us embarrassed because they aren't normal the way we think they should be. He gave honor, and he gave a place of dignity to those kind of people in a powerful way. What a wonderful way to go, rather than running away, giving honor to those people that are weak.
The Christian tradition, when a good person dies, we're both sad and joyful. Joyful because, as Dr. Graham just indicated, we believe he's with the Lord. But we're sad because we've lost something that is so special, a person so special, and an influence so special. But when we go from good to great, the joy is all the greater and the sadness all the deeper.
We'll take a break and come back, and others will join us from Rome on this special edition of Larry King Live. Don't go away. By the way, we will be including phone calls in this hour. Remaining with us, Father Michael Manning here in Los Angeles. In Washington, Father William J. Byron. Joining us in Rome is Christopher Dickey of Newsweek magazine. He's the Paris bureau chief. He's covered Pope John Paul II for more than a decade. Father Jonathan Morris, vice rector of the Seminary of the Legionnaires of Christ. And John Allen, Vatican reporter for the National Catholic Reporter and an analyst for CNN, observing the Vatican. Chris Dickey, what, in your opinion, separated him from other popes?
Certainly his longevity is a big part of it, the strength of his will, the force of his character, and he's also the first media pope, if you will. There was never any other pontiff before who lived in the age of satellite television, the internet, none who could project himself onto the world scene the way this pontiff has done, and none certainly who traveled as much as this one did. So he really is a pope like the world had never seen before, and we don't know if we'll ever see another one like him.
Father Morris, is there a sense to the Catholic, is there a sense of personal loss?
Oh, there certainly is. It's a very strange, surreal
ambiance that we're living in right here, just a few steps away from the Vatican, from the papal apartments, all of us feel great loss, but at the same time we feel a great joy knowing that he has made it. The message, I think, is the most important thing here that we need to go deep into. He was a great communicator, unbelievable communicator, but he had a message, and that message he was able to communicate all the way up into the very last moments of his life. And certainly we really miss him, and we're going to miss him even more in these days, but he did a great job, and we want to emulate that.
John Allen, we can't duck that. There were aspects of him, were there not, that were very controversial?
Oh, no question. I mean, before he was elected Pope, John Paul II preached a retreat for Pope Paul VI, and he titled his collected sermons in that retreat, The Sign of Contradiction. And in some sense, I think, as a Pope, he lived up to that motto. I mean, he was a man who was not afraid to take strong, tough positions, knowing that the price of that would be some people wouldn't agree with him. Inside the Catholic Church, even some of his stands had been divisive. There's a sort of liberal wing in Catholicism, particularly in the developed world, that actually felt quite disenfranchised under this papacy.